Well, good morning, church. I'll begin with an update. 2 weeks ago, I began my sermon by telling you about the massive mark on my forehead, about the size of a quarter. If you were not here that week, or if you've forgotten, 2 weeks ago, I stuck a arrow to my head with a suction cup on Saturday, and then when I pulled it off, it was a big mark, and it lasted about 7 days. But I'm happy to tell you it's not there anymore. But I wanted to tell you this morning that it actually inspired some art from our children at this congregation. So, yeah, nothing says I love you like a bullet in your head there. So, Matt McCook's daughter Katie drew that, and I asked her permission if it'd be okay, and she said that's fine. So, anyway, so tonight, let me tell you about lectureship. So there's no evening service as normal here at 5 o'clock. Instead, we will meet over in Hardeman Auditorium, which is across the street at Oklahoma Christian Campus. And to be honest, it's a little strange. I was asked to make this announcement, but I think it's the first time in my ministry career where I've had to promote an event in which I was the speaker. So if you're tired of hearing me, you don't have to come back tonight. But it's not just me. There's actually a lot of other stuff going on. I will give you a brief teaser. In my talk tonight, I will mention Martin Luther King Jr., Hillary Clinton, and Joey Chestnut, who won the hot dog eating competition this year. So if you're curious as far as how I'm going to put that together, you can come tonight. But there's a lot of other stuff going on. We'll sing starting at, 6:45, and then I'll be up at 7. And actually, I'm kind of a setup guy for the main act, which is a guy named Arthur Morton. And it's pretty powerful. He goes around the country doing a presentation reciting a large portion of the Gospel of John. And it's pretty cool. I've seen a video of it. So I think you'll be really blessed by that if you come tonight for OC lectureship. So a few years ago, I was in a park and I met a guy, and we struck up a conversation, and he was pretty interested in spiritual things. And so I ended up sharing my faith with this guy, which is not something I normally do. I usually build a relationship first, and after I have a relationship, then I will share my faith. But this was a case where he was interested, so I thought, why not? And so I just kind of launched into, here's the gospel, this is who Jesus is, this is what the Bible is, this is what grace is, this is what forgiveness is, here's what this all means for you. And I'm not saying it was like the best gospel presentation ever, but it wasn't like terrible. And at the end, my life that I don't have and I really need. And I said, yes, sir, what is that? And he said, I need an ice-cold can of Dr. Pepper. And I was thinking like, what? I don't have and I really need. And I said, yes, sir, what is that? And he said, I need an ice-cold can of Dr. Pepper. And I was thinking like, what? Like how did you get that from what I just said? I don't know. I went to the store and got him a Dr. Pepper. I don't know where I went wrong, but what I learned from that experience was speaking up increases the chances of screwing up. It's that way in life. It's that way in evangelism. And it is that lesson that keeps a lot of people from having the courage to say something about their faith. And so really what we've done the last month is I've tried to really lay a foundation of what exactly is the gospel, leading up to a point where I really want to start challenging us to start sharing our faith. And so we've talked, several weeks ago, we talked about how good deeds and good news are two sides of the same coin when it comes to the mission of God. We've talked about how if you don't care about lost people, nothing really matters. And then Travis did a great job last week of laying a foundation that we're ambassadors. This is our job, and God's asking us to do it. But what I want to do for the next few weeks is get practical. Like, okay, what do we do? What do we say? Where do we start? Because the truth is, you've probably got somebody in your life that you've thought about before when it comes to sharing your faith or bringing to church or something like that, but you don't know exactly what to do. Like maybe you've got someone in your life, but you think that if you brought up religion, like the conversation might get really intellectual, and what if they ask you some question and you don't know what to say, so you just don't do anything. Or for some people, you might have a relationship with a neighbor or a teacher or someone that you just see in public pretty often, and you've often thought, well, what would it be like to take that relationship to the next level and introduce some spiritual ideas, but you don't want to lose the relationship altogether. And so instead of taking this risk to maybe say a few things or take a risk, because you don't want to lose the relationship, you end up doing nothing. And so for a few weeks, I want to get really practical about some specific things that you can do that I think will really make a big difference in the lives of the people in your circle of influence. So I want to begin by looking at a verse from Acts chapter 1. It's the very first verse in this book. Acts begins this way. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day that he was taken up into heaven. So right off the get-go, we learn a few things about the book of Acts. First thing we learn is that Luke wrote it to a guy named Theophilus. Second thing we learn is that Acts is a sequel to a previous work. So Bible trivia here, Acts is a sequel to which gospel? The Gospel of Luke. And so we've got these two books, and they're written to one person. We don't know much about Theophilus. In fact, the only two times his name is mentioned in the Bible are at the beginning of Acts and the beginning of Luke. But what we do know is that Luke thought he was important enough to write these two books. In fact, to give you some context here, the Constitution of our country has 4,543 words. The Declaration of Independence has 1,337 words. If you were to write a research paper that had 20 pages in it, it would have 5,000 words. Luke Acts together has 37,932 words. And so what I want you to think about for a moment here is, especially with the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, those documents were written for masses of people, and yet they were pretty small. And yet you have this massive document, Luke Acts, and it's written for one guy. Like, think about that for a minute. Theophilus, he's like the ultimate nobody. He's not an elder from what we know about. He's not an apostle. He's not a disciple. We don't have any story in the entire Bible about what he did. We don't know anything about him. There's no VBS songs that talk about Theophilus. He's just this kind of forgotten person in the Bible. But here's the point. Luke thought he was valuable enough to write over 50 chapters in your Bible to one guy. Another way of putting this would be this. 25% of your New Testament is one person who cares enough about one person to tell him about one person. I mean, think about the power of that. Luke didn't know that billions of people would read his gospel. He did all these hours of research, and he spent all these weeks and months writing this down for one guy. One person cared enough about one person to tell him about one person. And so here's really the main idea this morning. Never underestimate the power of one. We're starting a series today for several weeks, and that's the main idea. Don't underestimate the power of one person, one conversation, one moment, one opportunity. One of the most famous humanitarian workers in the last 2 centuries is Mother Teresa. I'm not talking so much about what she believed, I'm talking about what she did, which is to help hundreds of thousands of poor people get on their feet. Well, one day a reporter came up to her in Calcutta and said, how will you ever make a difference in this country when there's 3,000 slums and there's new poor people coming into these slums every day? How do you hope to make a dent in this epidemic of poverty? Well, her answer was a pretty good answer. Here's what she said. I do not think the way that you think. I do not add up. I only subtract from the total dying. It's pretty good math. And so you think about your life. There is a certain number of people in this world that don't know Jesus. I don't know what that number is. But I do know that your life will either subtract from that number or will do nothing to that number. And so when it comes to your life, are you going to subtract from the total number of people in this world that don't know Jesus? It begins with one. In fact, you can trace the idea of one all throughout the book of Acts. You know, Acts begins kind of with fireworks. You've got Jesus. He's making his last speech. It's like the football coach at the right before the game starts. It's the final battle cry. Get ready. Go fight. Win the game. So Jesus gives this pretty great speech about you're going to get power from the Holy Spirit, and then you're going to be my witnesses throughout Judea and Samaria and to all the ends of the earth. And so it's hard to overstate the anticipation that happens at the beginning of this book. So you would think that right after Jesus gives this rally cry and then ascends up into heaven, you would think that the next verse would be the beginning of Pentecost, but it's not. There are these 15 verses in the book of Acts between the ascension and Pentecost, which are extremely random, they're extremely obscure, and what they are is you've got 11 apostles, and we're missing one. In other words, the entire mission of God is put on hold because they had to backfill a vacated staff position. One guy. 3,000 people, they don't get baptized yet. The reign of God does not descend on Jerusalem yet because they got to wait for one guy to take his seat at the table. Maybe God cares about one. Keep going through Acts. You get to Acts chapter 3. Peter and John are going up to the temple. They've been preaching to masses of people at this point. They put their ministry to the masses on hold to show benevolence to one guy. You go to chapter 8. Philip's doing fantastic ministry to lots of people, and God says, I want you to stop ministering to lots of people, and you go find one guy, Ethiopian eunuch. You get to Acts chapter 10, Peter's on a roof. God says, I want you to get off the roof. I want you to walk 35 miles up the coast for one person, Cornelius. You get to Acts chapter 16, Paul's praying by the river, and he stops his prayer because of one woman, Lydia. You see, God cares about one person. You see, the gospel calls us to be witnesses, but that does not mean you have to witness to the masses. And to be honest, this is what cripples some of us. We think that in order to be an effective witness for God, we need to get some kind of a degree. We need to go through a certain Bible training. We need to write a book so that millions of people can read it. We need to start a blog. We need to become a minister. We think that to reach people, we have to go to the masses. And so what happens is, because we can't do those things, we assume that we're failing, and so we don't do anything. But when you really look at the gospel and when you really look at Acts, what's true is that your one mission begins with one person. Just one person. And so I want you to start thinking about, okay, who's that one person in my life? Just one. That I might be able to point a little bit towards Christ. Just one person. So I was reading a book recently, and there was this story that was really compelling to me. It reminded me of a story in the Bible. And so I want to read you this story I read recently, a true story about a guy from Los Angeles, and I want you to try to guess which story from the Bible that it reminded me of. So the guy that wrote this book, his name is Greg Boyle. He spent 25 years helping gang members in Los Angeles, and then he wrote a book about his experiences. His book's got an interesting title, Tattoos of the Heart. And one of the chapters in this book, Greg talks about going to a juvenile detention center to visit a 15-year-old boy named Rigo, who's been in jail for about 1.5 years. He sits down and starts trying to get to know this boy. And so he first says, tell me about your dad. Well, this 15-year-old boy, Rigo, starts crying, and here's what he says. My dad's a heroin addict, and he's never been in my life. He used to always beat me. I think I was in 4th grade. I came home, sent home in the middle of the day. When I got home, my dad says, why'd they send you home? And because my dad always beat me, I said, if I tell you, promise you won't hit me. And he just said, I'm your father. Of course, I'm not going to hit you. So I told him. But he beat me. He beat me with a pipe. Well, then in the book, Greg says that Rigo starts convulsing and crying uncontrollably. So Greg tries to redirect the conversation, and he says, well, what about your mom? Tell me about your mom, Rigo. And Rigo looked across the room, and he pointed at this really small woman sitting a few feet away. And this is what he said about his mother. That's her over there. There's no one like her. I've been locked up for 1.5 years, and she comes to see me every Sunday. You know how many buses she takes every Sunday to see me? At this point, Rigo starts to cry again in the book. And then he says, 7 buses. She takes 7 buses. Imagine. What an image. You got this woman woman of small stature in Los Angeles trekking across this busy city for hours on 7 buses for one boy. And so which story in the Bible do you think that reminded me of? Anybody have a guess? It reminded me of the Prodigal Son. Because when you think about that story, what happens is this son, he makes these bad decisions. He rejects his father. He disobeys his father. He really insults his father. He goes off and he starts wasting all this money. But the minute he turns back, and the minute he says, you know what, maybe I could go back home. Do you remember what the father does in that story? The father goes up on the hill and he looks out in the distance for one. In fact, here's how Luke tells that story on the lips of Jesus, Luke 15. While he was still a long ways off, his father saw him, one person. And he was filled with compassion for him. Again, one person. And he runs to this one person. You see, in this story, we don't read about a God who's the God of the masses. We read about a God who is the God of one. We don't read about a God who's kind of a cookie-cutter God who just mass produces disciples. We read about a God who will go to great lengths to show compassion and concern for one single person. He sees the one. He runs to the one. He forgives the one. He blesses the one. He loves the one. And guess how many people it takes for God to start a party? Well, Luke tells us in the same chapter, there is more rejoicing in heaven, say it with me, over one. There's more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 that do not need to repent. If there are screens in the hallways of heaven, they're not going to show statistics. They're going to tell stories because God cares about the one. And so here's what this means for you. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 that we are being transformed into the image of God. So what this means is that the more you become like the one God, the more you're going to care about one person. Because the one God that you worship cares about one. And so what we're going to do for several weeks is we're just going to focus on one. And so the one question I want you to think about this morning is, who is your one? And every week I'm going to introduce one new idea of here's something you can do for your one. And so here's the one thing that you can do this week for your one. Let's go back to the beginning of Acts. Before Pentecost, before Cornelius, before Saul becomes Paul, before Stephen is stoned, they actually did something. It's often overlooked. Acts chapter 1, verse 14. They all joined together constantly in prayer, along with women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. Everybody's praying at the beginning of Acts. You see, prayer in Acts, it's not some rubber stamp that they put on things to make themselves feel spiritual. Prayer in the book of Acts serves as the foundation for every single movement of God. See, one thing I think we have to be careful of when it comes to outreach is it's really easy to think that your output produces your outcome. In other words, it's easy to think that if you just try really hard and if you come up with some great strategy and then you execute that strategy, it's easy to think that it was you that did that work. But if you read Acts carefully, it is God who initiates the work. And so if you ever want to make a difference in people's lives around you, that has to begin with prayer. You see, prayer is the ultimate antidote to the workaholic. Because prayer is not about achieving. Prayer is about submitting to the one that's already at work. You see, in prayer we acknowledge that God is already on the move. In prayer we acknowledge that God is already on mission. And it is my job to align my heart and my mind with the purposes of God. And so if I don't pray, what that means is I'm going to spend my whole life carrying out my will. You see, mission to the world begins with submission in prayer. And if you don't pray, then your mission's not going to be all that effective. In fact, here, I'm going to show you something. I showed you this if you were here 5 years ago, and I'll probably show you again if I'm still here and you're still here in 5 years, because it's so important. This slide is the entire book of Acts on one screen, if you'll hit this next click here. And we're going to start reading it from the beginning. It's the entire book right there. And if you hit this next button here, these are the significant turning points in the book of Acts. You got tons of them. You got the God adding to the church, Stephen's stone, Paul's missionary journeys. You got a prison break, a shipwreck. You got all these great events in the book of Acts. Every single one of these events in the book of Acts, if you hit this next one, they all are preceded by the prayers of God's people. Every single one of them. And so we often talk about Acts as this demonstrative book about what the Holy Spirit's doing through the people of God to the world, and that's so true, but it all begins with people on their knees. Never underestimate the power of prayer. You see, you don't change someone's life because you've got a great idea, or because you try really hard, or because you've got a great personality. Change always begins with prayer. I don't know how it works. I don't have some formula I can explain to you. All I know is when I read Scripture, God's activity is always released. Who's your one? Who's your one? Who's your one? Pray for your one. Every day this week, pray that God blesses your one. Pray that the peace of God would fall on your one. Pray that the heart of your one would be softened by God. In fact, there's a few things I want you to do right now to go ahead and start this. One is I want you to look on the ends of your pews. I got magnets, a bunch of magnets in the room. I want you to pass them down. They're blank magnets. I want everybody to go home today with a magnet. All I want you to do is I want you to write the name of the one person in your life who's far from God that you want to pray for this week. Just write the first name of that person down, and then stick it on your refrigerator, stick it on your mirror. Just put it somewhere where you'll see it a lot. In fact, I don't know what you're doing for lunch today, but I would really encourage you. This is something I want you to talk about with people at lunch. Who's your one? If you got a small group tonight, you bring your magnets and you write your one and you say, this is my one. I want you to pray for my one. If you're a parent and you've got kids, I don't care how old your kids are. They can be little kids, they can be teenagers. This is a great family exercise I want you to do tonight. Who's your one? And all I want you to do is just start praying for your one. Second thing I want you to do right now is if you could get out your cell phone. If you got a cell phone, I want you to get it out, please. I know you're not going to hear the rest of my sermon because you're going to be playing on your phone, but I want you to do something. I actually want, if you'll hit the next slide here, I want you to text the first name of the person you want to pray for to the number that you see on the screen. We're not going to know who you are. It's totally anonymous. We're not going to text you back. This is not some service where you're signing up for something to get a bunch of texts that you don't want to receive. The only reason I want you to do this, really, is two reasons. Number one is, we as leaders at this church family, we want to pray for your one. I want to know the name of your one so I can pray for that person. Our elders want to know the name of your one so they can pray for that person. Second reason I want you to text your one to this number is next week, we're going to take all the names you text in, and we're going to create something that we'll show to you next week so we can be encouraged to pray for our one. If you hit the next one here, our elders and staff have already committed to start praying for their one. And so these are the initials that on the screen of what our elders and staff are praying for. And so right now, text the first name of the person that you want to pray for to this number. I'm going to pause for about 15, 20 seconds to let you do that, and then I'll wrap up my sermon here. I want to end with sharing a story. Some of you have probably heard this story, but I couldn't think of a better story to end this sermon that really highlights the main point. Never underestimate the power of one, and never underestimate the power of prayer. Some of you probably remember the story of Jack Hoffman, 7-year-old boy diagnosed with a brain tumor at age 7. He had 2 surgeries. He went through 60 weeks of chemo. And in the middle of his journey battling this awful form of cancer, he met the guy you see on the screen. His name is Rex Burkhead. He happens to be a football player for the University of Nebraska. Rex really took an interest in Jack, and they became friends over the course of the spring. And on April 6th last year, they had the spring training game in which the Nebraska football squad would start to play against each other. So that day, the stands were full of 60,000 people, and Rex had an idea. He talked to the football coaches, and he said, would it be okay if little Jack could enter the game? And the coaches said that'd be just fine. And so here's what happened next.
And he's wearing the number 22, guys.
It is Jack Hoffman of Team Jack coming out on the field right now in this 4th down and short. Jack Hoffman has been adopted really by this football team. A young man who has battled brain cancer is on the field right now for the Huskies.
One more snap for Taylor Martinez, too, who will hand it off to Jack.
So Taylor gets the shotgun set, gives it to Jack. Here he goes. He's got blockers out in front.
There he
Jack
goes.
is running the midfield. Listen to this crowd as Jack Hoffman, a young man that, as I mentioned, has really been adopted by this football team, just scored a touchdown.
Oh, wow. What a moment.
And both benches empty.
That was a moment right there. Wow, goosebumps.
So after that day, Jack went on to meet the President of the United States. He put that picture up. Later that year, he won an SP for his story. And his story actually helped raise hundreds of thousands of dollars in this country for pediatric oncology. But really what I want you to remember from this story is, how did it all begin? It all began when one guy, Rex, decided to love one kid, Jack. And the ripple effects from what happened with one act of kindness are unfathomable. And so who's your one? You know, you can't love everyone, but you can love someone. And so all I'm asking you to do this week is to pray for one. And so we're going to sing a song in just a minute. There might be one person in the room that you're not so sure what to do. When you turn back to God, you're not so sure what to do. When you turn back to God, God doesn't look at you with anger and hate and judgment. He looks at you with compassion and love. And someone this morning might be that one person you need to come back to God. If that's you, you come tell me about that. If you need this church to pray for you, tell me about that as well. Let's stand and let's sing.